Okay, we're going to deal with, in the last video until probably Tuesday or Wednesday, we're going to deal a little with the Russiagate controversy as well as what's going on with Rod Rosenstein. And we'll read a little bit from this, or maybe we'll read the whole way through. It doesn't seem to be very long, but the Chicago Tribune analysis of the New York Times article where they claimed that Rosenstein had talked about, ways to invoke the 25th Amendment and wearing wires while going to talk to Donald Trump. And we'll talk a little about the significance of it. So this is actually written by Aaron Blake from the Washington Post. But, I guess it isn't as bad to click on the Chicago Tribune. So take it for what it's worth. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein in 2017 talked about using a wire to record President Donald Trump, according to memos written by then acting FBI Director Andrew McCabe and FBI lawyer Lisa Page. According to McCabe's memo, he also broached the 25th Amendment, a method of removing the president by members of his cabinet. Rosenstein has issued 2 denials. That much we know. What we don't know about the story that was first reported by the New York Times on Friday, though, is much more voluminous, including just how serious was Rosenstein. And perhaps more importantly, we don't know what it could portend for a president who has seemed anxious to get rid of people in charge of the Russia investigation, including Rosenstein, who oversees Special Counsel Robert Mueller III's probe. Below are 4 big questions that should be answered in the days, weeks, and months ahead. Number 1, was Rosenstein being sarcastic? This seems to be the explanation of choice. Of choice for who? Even in his denials, Rosenstein didn't explicitly say he never talked about wearing a wire or the 25th Amendment. He instead said he never, quote, pursued it. It's also inconspicuous that the Justice Department furnished to the Times an anonymous source who said Rosenstein was being sarcastic. That would appear to be a tacit admission that Rosenstein said these things. The Washington Post also has sources who say the remark was sarcastic, but the Times account is dubious about that argument. The Times reported that Rosenstein assured others he was being serious. It even talked about getting Attorney General Jeff Sessions and then Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly, now White House Chief of Staff, on board with the 25th Amendment gambit. One source told the Post that Rosenstein mentioned recording Trump twice in one day, which would suggest it wasn't just a passing joke. There are a couple of mitigating factors. One is that this story appears to trace back to McCabe's contemporaneous memos. McCabe was rather unceremoniously fired from the FBI this year and faces possible criminal charges. At the same time, his attorney says he has no knowledge of how any member of the media obtained these memos. The second is that it's simply difficult to see Rosenstein being serious about this. He's got a reputation as a very by-the-book law enforcement official. Where have we heard that before? Indeed, any law enforcement official talking about this would be highly unorthodox. All of that said, this was at a time when Rosenstein reportedly felt Trump used him and his memo as a false pretext for firing then FBI Director James Comey. Emotions run high, and perhaps that's what happened with Rosenstein, or maybe he was just being sarcastic. For Rosenstein to feel bad, to feel, misused for writing a memo that he himself was told to pen, justifying the firing of James Comey, he would really, if he didn't want James Comey to be fired, he should have never written that memo. 2, who is the source and what is their agenda? Well, it's kind of surprising that the Washington Post is questioning the motives of anonymous sources. The Washington Post, which all the time uses anonymous sources. Almost instantly, talk turned to whether Trump would fire Rosenstein, which seems like something that's been on his to-do list for a very long time. Some even accused the Times of serving as stooges for the White House to build a pretext for that, much as Trump allegedly used Rosenstein to fire Comey. That's all speculation based on little besides suspicion and partisanship. But what's clear is that if the White House is behind this somehow, its agenda is pretty evident, and that's to fire Rosenstein and or send a message. If anybody else put this out there or gasped, it came about simply via good, ambitious reporting. The end result might be the same, but it won't be so certain. If this emanated from McCabe or someone who wanted to build on the 25th Amendment narrative, more on that later, that would also make sense. 3, does Trump fire Rosenstein? That certainly just became more possible, and the Post has reported Trump asked advisors Friday whether he should do it. but that doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen or that it's a wise decision. Firing Rosenstein has long been a political minefield, and that remains the case. Getting a replacement who might be friendly is hardly a sure bet, and the move could still carry political blowback from Republicans worried about Trump blowing up the Russia investigation. That said, some House Republicans have moved to impeach Rosenstein, and it could be tougher for other Republicans to dismiss the idea that Rosenstein is an uncompromised overseer of the Russia probe. White House aides are reportedly advising Trump to wait rather than saying he necessarily shouldn't fire Rosenstein. There's also an argument to be made, though, that this could create a false sense of security for Trump to fire Rosenstein and that he could be tempted to do it in a way that he perhaps shouldn't. Those around Trump have prevailed upon him not to do so. Their job just got more difficult, assuming some will still try to stop him. And 4, how widespread is the 25th Amendment talk really? While this all would otherwise seem to be a good thing for Trump, that doesn't change one troubling fact. This story is about more people fretting about his unfitness to be president and going so far as to talk about doing something extraordinary about it. This is the second time in 2 weeks we've heard about senior Trump administration officials broaching the 25th Amendment, which is used to remove a president deemed unfit for office. The first time was in that anonymous New York Times op-ed. Increasingly, it seems those around Trump are so alarmed by his conduct that they are willing to entertain drastic options. That sure makes Bob Woodward's book ring true. So I'll tell you what. This article is actually a bit of misdirection. And let's go through each one of these. Was Rosenstein being sarcastic? So this is once again people involved in the media trying to assume motive, trying to assume intent based on what's convenient for them. They don't really care necessarily about actions. And you can see whether you're talking about the Hillary Clinton email investigation, in which they said, well, unfortunately, that you cannot prove the intent. Well, this is somebody who deliberately took steps to conceal documents, to put a server in a private server to use for state business, which is illegal. and they always try to debate intent when we're talking about illegal acts, if these are illegal acts. Now, Rosenstein, if he would have wiretapped the president of the United States, that would have effectively been an act of espionage. It doesn't matter. Now, let's also remember that being as it is that there's no evidence that he did wiretap Trump or I guess swear a wire while talking to Trump, and we've never seen any evidence that he's presented any, I guess, incriminating evidence in any other form, such as memos, such as notes or whatever. So what exactly would he have that's incriminating on Trump? Okay, that would have been an act of espionage, because you're not actually talking about him exposing illegal acts with Donald Trump. Okay, and then you're talking about basically spying on the president of the United States, which is illegal, violating numerous different stipulations within, I guess, the Department of Justice. Remember, a lot of these things. Now, he's the Deputy Attorney General, so I guess technically he can approve his own surveillance. Okay, let's play devil's advocate here. Rod Rosenstein is Deputy Attorney General. He has authority to approve FISA warrants, but I would say that that's a good question, whether he can approve just regular old wires, wearing like a personal recording device to a meeting. Maybe he can do it, but the fact of the matter is that if you're debating intent here, you're talking about something that could impact the credibility of one of two people. If this story is true, and it could be untrue, it could be untrue that the New York Times might have been fed some sort of load of crap from somebody, whether it's a Trump supporting official, whether it's a Trump opponent who would want to undermine Trump's confidence in the Justice Department and in Rosenstein specifically. If this proves to be a false report, or it's proven that McCabe was lying about this incident, it seriously undermines McCabe's own credibility if this was indeed in McCabe's memos, or it undermines the credibility of the New York Times, which has, for I guess the second time in about 3 weeks, published unverifiable stories so far coming from within the Trump administration. They already mentioned that anonymous op-ed from somebody who claimed that they were the resistance within the administration. So all they're doing is saying, if proven true, that there is a deep state working to undermine Donald Trump, that there are officials who have a loyalty more towards their own job, as such as it is, rather than to the mission of the United States government, which is which is basically to execute the laws of the legislature. You know, Donald Trump is the head of the executive branch. You cannot unilaterally disobey, if you're working for the federal government, the orders of the President of the United States. If you want to, you have to either resign, or there's ways to become a whistleblower. This is not really being a whistleblower in most of these cases, because what are they revealing in terms of incriminating information about Trump? In this report, what incriminating information are they revealing about Donald Trump? I'll ask again. If this is a whistleblower talking about what's going on in the White House, what incriminating information are they revealing about Donald Trump? All they're talking about is Rosenstein and McCabe's attitudes towards Trump and some of the contingencies that they were prepared to go through. So that's just point one. And I guess point two, because we talked about who is the source and what is their agenda. Does Trump fire Rosenstein? I would say this. If these stories continue to leak out about Rod Rosenstein and eventually some of them prove to be true, he might not have to fire Rosenstein. He could create enough pressure to force Jeff Sessions. And, you know, it's difficult to conceive of Jeff Sessions taking any deliberate action as of right now, because the man's basically like a lily pad floating on the pond, basically doesn't do anything. But he could compel Jeff Sessions to tell Rosenstein, either you recuse yourself from this investigation, and I guess it would go to the Associate Attorney General, which is the third ranking Justice Department official, or I'm going to have to either fire you or you're going to have to resign. And if that happens, you know, if Rosenstein does not resign, you could see some sort of crisis where, yes, the House would impeach him all the way, and I'm not sure exactly how that works. I'm not sure if they can actually remove him from office. I would say I'm not sure if the Senate is required to remove somebody like the Deputy Attorney General. So that's kind of an unknown for me, and we would have to hear from somebody who's more of a legal authority to figure that out. And then the fourth point, how widespread is the 25th Amendment talk really? So they're trying to make it seem. It says this is the second time in 2 weeks we've heard about senior Trump administration officials broaching the 25th Amendment, which is used to remove it. So I'll say this. This is not exactly accurate, okay? Yes, it's the second time in 2 weeks we've heard about this happening. But this was not something that has occurred. This event has not occurred in the past 2 weeks, because McCabe, if you remember, was fired in early spring. I think he was fired either in February or March. I don't remember precisely, but it's definitely been several months since then. And the events that I think that are being discussed here are actually from the spring of 2017. So Bob Woodward's book, okay, whether this validates what he's talking about, is irrelevant to this discussion. This is just Rod Rosenstein. Basically, if it is to be believed, it's Rod Rosenstein in 2017 discussing with other DOJ officials and maybe FBI officials ways that they could remove Donald Trump from office. But it doesn't mean that the confidence that Trump is unfit for office has increased lately. Okay, do you understand what that means? They're basically they're doing a bit of a sleight of hand. They're taking the timeline and they're moving the fact that this was revealed now to say that nowadays, you know, you see that people do believe that Trump is unfit for office. Now, if you would ask, first of all, Rod Rosenstein has denied these two allegations. So what are we supposed to do now? we have to reveal whether he actually, for sure did issue these communications with Andy McCabe or talk to him, and that would involve, according to some sources that I've read, that would involve swearing him under oath and having him testify, possibly in Congress. And it's a good question whether he'd be willing to do that. If he's not willing to do that, I think he will be eventually either fired or forced to resign, because in all honesty, how much can people take from this person? So I think that addresses all of the 4 points in this article. Now, I'll have to address a further point that they don't really broach, which is really, what is the effect of these intrigues involving Rod Rosenstein and Andy McCabe and Jim Comey and Jeff Sessions? People have to understand that the excuse that the media and the Democratic Party have been using to claim that the Russia probe is valid and that it is something that is solid, one of the major excuses is that it uses that, like, the main players are registered Republicans. They always they use that term, registered Republicans, for Comey, for I believe Rosenstein served under George W. Bush. He is a registered Republican, at least officially. Then Mueller is a registered Republican. And then, of course, Jeff Sessions was a Republican senator for several years. So what does this mean to undermining the Democratic narrative? Because, yes, these are all registered Republicans. People in the media seem to ignore this. My last video, the one that just went out, is called, I titled it, "The Falcon Cannot Hear the Falconer." And what that means is that they are they're not hearing correctly the popular voice from the people who did vote in the 2016 election for Donald Trump, or for one of the other like Jill Stein. Let's throw her in there. So what we're talking about are people who, in many cases, reject the partisan divide, and they in a certain sense, okay? And I'll explain it this way: the Republican Party of John McCain, of Karl Rove, of George Bush, of some of these other characters that are near the top, Dick Cheney. Of course, there's Bush. There's the Bushes in general, Jeb Bush. The Republican Party is not what won the 2016 election in the eyes of the public. Okay, yes, a lot of the people who are elected to Congress, whether it's the Senate or the House, or at governor's races, yes, they were George Bush supporters. But it's very clear that the Trump administration is a drastic departure from the Bush administration. There were a lot of registered Republicans. Okay, this was one of the main talking points against Donald Trump during the election from the Hillary Clinton campaign and her super PACs, that there were so many Bush-era officials that were willing to endorse Hillary Clinton. There were a lot of them. I think, there was like a whole laundry list. David Frum was probably the most famous, and then there were some other ones like Bill Kristol that said that he was such a danger that they were going to vote for Hillary Clinton. Bill Kristol is basically like the arch goblin of the neo-conservative movement. So for them to come then and say, well, you're out of your mind, because why is it that all of these registered Republicans would try to torpedo Trump out of malice? Well, the fact is that there were a lot of senior registered Republican intelligence officials, national security officials, members of the defense establishment, members of the mainstream Republican media, members of the Republican Party that were basically saying that Donald Trump is going to be the doom of that party. And that's why they, Karl Rove's entire reputation basically fell apart during the 2016 election. I don't even remember who he was either supporting Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or one of these other clowns that was basically a cardboard cutout set up in order to keep the Republican Party pushing an agenda that was a purely corporate agenda. So then why would you then ask the media why these Republican gargoyles would then support some sort of maneuver like the Rosenstein maneuver to have him declared unfit to be president, and then the 25th Amendment would be invoked by I guess, over half of the cabinet and Mike Pence, and then Pence would take over as president, and Trump would be out of there. Well, the answer is almost self-evident. The answer is found in basically all of the statements made by a lot of these media figures during the 2016 election. Okay, so I hope that you guys were able to follow this all. I know that it's deliberately being misrepresented. The way that they misrepresented, how, oh, now everybody's talking more and more about the 25th Amendment. No, we're revealing that they talked about it last year. Okay, so stop trying to misrepresent the timeline. Stop trying to misrepresent the people. The American people are not trying to vote for officials solely based on party affiliation, because it's already been a failure. Okay, obviously the Republican Party is being transformed by Donald Trump. To some extent, the Democratic Party is being transformed in the aftermath of Hillary Clinton. That's also up for debate. But you cannot say because somebody is a registered Republican or a registered Democrat that they can be trusted to uphold any sort of, basically to hold a certain set of principles, because people already don't trust the two-party system as is. That's about it. Please like my video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the live streaming channel, Razor Ray Live Wounds, which this week I didn't have one, but maybe later on Wednesday. And that's about it. Have a great rest of your week.